Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is part A of our 7th lecture on Descriptive Statistics and Islamic Approach. In this lecture, we will assess if exports and growths are related with each other, that is, high exports leads to high growth, or vice versa. We start our discussion of exports. We will discuss some preliminary concepts, basic and fundamental, which are causation, correlation, and association. Whereas Fisherian statistics is never concerned with causation, it only looks at correlations. Our goal in real statistics is always the discovery of causal relationships. But there is a difficult problem that is created because causality is never observable in the data. The data can never tell you about the causal relationships. And the reason is very simple. If X is the cause of Y, it means that if X had been different, then Y would have been different. But this is something which can't be observed because we are thinking about what might have happened if X had taken a different value. This is an imaginary event. This is why some philosophers have said that you can never observe causality. You can only see that first X happened and then Y happened. You can never see that X is actually the cause of Y. However, in real statistics, we don't look at the data only. In fact, that's one of the big differences. We always try to go beyond the data, and we will see how this can be done. Variables are associated if they move together, and this association is observable. But association is very different from causality. In association, we see that both variables move together, but we don't know if it's because X causes Y, or whether it's because Y causes X, or whether because there is some third variable which is moving both of them. And as the third variable Z moves, both X and Y move together with it, and so they seem to be related. In fact, they are not related, but it's the common cause that is creating the relationship. So causality is very different from observable. However, the only thing we have is the observable movement together. So from the observable movement together, this gives us a clue to causality. And in order to discover causality, we need to work harder at examining the structures of the real world, which are not actually part of the data. So discovery of causal structures is of utmost importance, but we will not be addressing this in this lecture 7. We will only look at how to look at associations, and also to use these associations to guess at the causal relationships. Long and complicated history about how statistics became blind to the idea of causality. And this has been explored in detail by Judea Pearl in his book called The Book of Why, in which he has given this history in detail. I will just go over some of the ideas briefly. Galton was looking at the inheritance of genius, and he discovered that genius parents don't have children who are equally geniuses. They are more normal, although they are brighter than average, but they are not geniuses. So this he called the regression to the mean, and he thought this was a causal relationship. There was some cause for this. But he later discovered that there was no cause. This is just a statistical phenomena. And this idea that causation did not actually matter and only correlation mattered was picked up by his follower Pearson, and he turned this into a maxim that there is no such thing as causation and there is only correlation. And this idea became embedded in the foundations of statistics. There is an interesting story about how Sewell Wright actually discovered the correct way to look at causation at that time, but he got into a fight with Sir Ronald Fisher and on some other issue, genetics, and therefore Fisher, who was a very vindictive man and never tolerated any kind of criticism, did not propagate or praise or recognize the contributions of Sewell, and therefore causality remained undiscovered for 50 years. In this lecture, we will not be looking much at causation. We will only look at association. Are two variables moving together? Now, this word association is not the standard word used in statistics. In statistics, they use correlation for this same concept. However, correlation is now technically associated with the normal distribution. There is a particular formula, and there are many ideas and concepts. So we will just bypass this. We will not use the word correlation, and we will use the word with the same meaning, association, but that's because association is just an intuitive and a qualitative concept, and it doesn't apply to normal distributions, whereas correlation is far more strongly tied to normal distribution, and it has a particular formula and a particular interpretation, and so on. So basically, we can look at associations. We can use these associations to infer patterns of causality, but we can never be actually sure because we don't actually directly observe causal relationships. So much in the way of background, we come to the main topic of this lecture, which is the theory of export-led growths. So there is exports and there is growth, and the question is, are these two things related to each other? Economists have argued that exports are the drivers of growth, and so if your country wants to grow, then it should focus on increasing its exports. This has been very strongly advocated, and the export-led growth theory has a lot of articles published which seem to show that this is true. But there are other people who are skeptical about this idea, and they say that no, growth-led export. So if you have growth, your economy will grow, and obviously you will have more goods and you will be able to export more goods. So actually exports are caused by growth. The third possibility is that both hypotheses are true. As you grow, you start exporting more, but greater exports stimulate growth and so on. So there is a virtuous cycle in which growths promote exports, exports promote growth, and this goes back and forth. So that's a mutual causation. And the fourth possibility that these two are independent things. Growth occurs for different reasons, exports occur for different reasons, and there are no particular relationship. And if you look at the research articles on this, you can find support for all four of these ideas. In front of us is that we have a huge data set collected by the World Bank called the WDI, World Development Indicators, which has exports, growths of all sorts and types. And the question is just to see, what is this data telling us? The first problem that arises when we try to use the WDI dataset is that there are many export series and many GDP series. So which one should we use? Well, after looking at a lot of different series, there is only one series which directly measures exports as a percentage of GDP. So I decided to use that for the measure of how much export oriented a country is. The idea, if this percentage is high, then the country has high exports. And there is only one series in the WDI data set which measures the growth rate for the GNI, the gross national income. So this again I take as the series for the growth. There is a mystery here in that the GNI growth rate series has a lot of missing data. Now the data set for GDP itself is almost complete. Every country has a GDP for every year almost. So by taking the ratio of the GDPs, you can figure out the percentage growth. But the WDI set, even though it has the GDPs for many years, it doesn't record a growth rate. Why is that? There is a reason for that, probably, that these GDP numbers are guesses, and when you take ratios of guesses, you get even more wild guesses. So probably that's why the WDI data set has missing growth rates for many periods for which we could calculate the growth rate by using WDI data itself. Typically, the series that I plan to use has a code NYGNP marketplace KDZG, which is described as follows. This is just taken directly out of the WDI data set. So this is the series that I will use for the growth rates. As far as I could tell, this is the only growth rate series. You could also indirectly calculate growth rates from a number of different GDP series that they have, but I didn't do that. Similarly, there's this other series ne.x.gnfs.zs, which is the ratio of exports to GDP, and this is described in the WDI sets in the terms that are written on the slide, and basically this is the only series which measures this number, and so this is what I take as my export series. So now I want to see if these two series are related to each other. So now we are in a position to come to the topic of the lecture, whether the growths and exports move together, and we will develop methods to assess this. We look at the association. We want to look at these two series separately. The main lesson of this particular lecture is that we need to understand our series. We need to understand the real world context which generates the data. And so we will now examine the two series, one for growth rates and the other for exports separately, to see what they tell us about the real world. So we calculate the 5 quartiles of the GNI growth rates as they move across time, and you will see that the minimum, the dark blue line, and the maximum are huge, and the middle 3 quartiles are in the middle. So the maximum is large and the minimum is large and negative, and these make it hard to see the patterns in the center. So look at the maxima separately. So we find that the maximum value is 34% of growth rate in 1963, and this happens in Algeria. If you look at the growth rates, it's -13, -20, 34, 5, 6. So this is very strange that there is a huge outlier in Algeria in 1963. Why did Algeria have 34% growth rate in 1963? For that, you have to look at the history of Algeria. This turns out that 1963 was the first year of peace after a prolonged war of liberation from France, in which you had, and that explains why you had negative growth, because basically a war of independence was going on in Algeria for 61 and 62. So after recovery, there was a huge bounce to basically normal levels, and then normal growth following that. You look at Kenya, which has high growth rates in 71 and 72, and you look at it's -4%, 22%, 17%, 3%, 5%, and you ask why in 71 and 72 Kenya had enormous growth. I don't know. It could be a data artifact. Maybe Kenya changed the way they calculated GDP in those years, or maybe it reflects something real which happened in Kenya in those years. You have to go and look at the history of Kenya to find out. Similarly, you have this country Benin, which comes out at the top in 72, and it has 27% growth rate, but it has -11% in the previous year, 8%, 9% in the one before that, and 4% in the year after that. So again, this 27% is a very unusual outlier. Why did it happen? Similarly, you have Gabon, which has highest rates in 74 and 75 at 35 and 22, and in 76 it's 37, but 9%, -12, and -27 in 77 and 78. So again, these are very unusual numbers, and they reflect some unusual historical process. As the main theme of our real statistics is that numbers provide a clue to reality. So these numbers are providing a very big clue, and to find out the meaning of these numbers, we have to go and look at what's happening in Gabon. So, but basically one thing we learned from studying the maximum is that the maximum is usually very unusual circumstance. If you look at the second layer of numbers after removing the maximum, So you find that it's about 10 to 13%, a big difference from the maximum. And these are the star performers. These are people who are doing some normal economic processes very well to achieve growth rates of 10, 11, 13%. You can't achieve more than that except by some unusual non-economic phenomena. So the maxima are not really worth examining. Similarly, for the minima are usually caused by crisis and catastrophe, and they don't give us too much in the way of lessons in terms of what we should avoid to have low growth. So we abandon looking at maximum and minimum in this series, and we turn to the middle three quartiles. So these middle quartiles, these tell a very interesting and important story. See just look at the gray line, which is the median growth rate. What is this the median of? You look at all of the median growth rates for all of the countries, and then you take a second median, the median of all. So this is the median over all countries of the median growth rate. And so you find that this is varying between 4 and 6% from 1960 to 1973. This is a period of great prosperity when you have high growth rates throughout the world, and at least in the middle half, not barring this, the exceptional good or the exceptional bad. The middle half has growth rates between 4 and 6%, but then there is a crash in 1973. This crash was caused by an oil crisis, and basically this crash was taken as an opportunity by free market theorists to discredit Keynesian economics, which had achieved great prosperity, and bring in the new agenda of free market economics. So this was the beginning of the rise of Chicago School of Free Market and the downfall of Keynesian economics. So and then there is a middle period which goes from basically 1980s to about 2000, where the growth rates are between 2 and 4%, and the economic performance was fairly stable. And this was the period where Chicago School, starting with the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, these policies were dominant. Around 2000, this Chicago School succeeded in removing all financial regulations that were put in place in the Great Depression, and the result was the global financial crisis in 2007, which was very similar to the Great Depression and had similar reasons. When you leave the financial sector without regulations, then they go berserk like this. And so there was a great crash, and then there was again reconsideration that maybe Keynes was right after all. So these historical events are reflected in these growth rates, and you can't understand this jagged graph until you understand the story behind the graph, which I have described very briefly. Similarly, we can look at the global exports to GDP ratios across time. If you look at this, the maximum export ratio is in the blue line. It's roughly stable until 2000, and then it takes off after the financial deregulation. There's a crash in 2007, and then there is unexpected pickup, and then there is another crash, and the export GDP ratio goes down, but never as low as the pre-2000 period. It means that the process of globalization, which linked the economies, you see, we're looking at the export to GDP ratio, and so this ratio has become high throughout the world. But this is the maximum, so we can't really infer what is happening in the world from this. For that, we have to look at the middle three quartiles to get the idea of what is happening in the middle 50% of the countries. So the middle three quartiles of export growth show that exports increased steadily from 15% to 30% from 1960 to 1980. That's the Keynesian period. And then this remained stagnant around 30%. Didn't go down, but didn't go up until about 2000. And then 2000 was the year in which financial liberation was achieved, the laws that were passed in the Great Depression were repealed, and so that led to a big surge in trade until about 2007, where there was a crash. After the crash, the trade, there are a few dips up and down, but the level has remained fairly stable, around almost 40%, slightly under that. So basically, post global financial crisis, the trade hasn't been going up, but it has also not been going down, but there have been erratic movements. So all of this is the story of exports to growth ratio, and this is tied to the picture of the international trading system and how much trade has been going on, and basically what you call the global village, the increase in exports and the offshoring of production. All of these are reflected to some extent in this picture. So with this, we will end this first part of the lecture, in which we have done the theoretical backgrounds for correlation, association, causation, and we have also done a preliminary investigation of the data. In the next portion of the lecture, we will actually look at whether or not exports and growth move together as according to the export-led growth hypothesis.